Hey, so today I'm going to be working through more italic fixing as I've done in the last video or two, and I think it might be a little more informative to most people if I go through and fix some display bold italics, because they've actually got some like thickness to them, which makes some things easier and some things harder. Um, yeah, I also did this process for the display hairline, and I showed a little bit of that in the first video. So first things first, this is a prepped font, as I explained in my process about preparing fonts for italics. I run a script that slants everything that is totally straight lines just to the italic angle. And then things that have curvature, I kind of do a mix of slanting and skewing. Or sorry, slanting, aka skewing, and rotating to get them a little closer to what I want them to be. And you can see here, I've actually got some draft Cyrillic characters in this specific weight for name stands as well. I did those for a workshop with Maria Dorelli and Krista Radova. Awesome workshop. And someday I would like to add Cyrillics to the whole family, but it's a very big process, and this is a very big family. So right now, those are just kind of there as like a reminder draft for myself. One thing that's interesting is you can see how like some glyphs work pretty well with this slanting approach, or this, sorry, like italic preparation approach. And then some get really weird. Like a lot of this is from components that have been manipulated and then maybe that have been like rotated, for instance. This is kind of a funny one, this OE. You can see that like one of these is a component and the other is a round contour. I'm not going to think through all of that just yet because the first thing that I want to kind of go in and fix up, like many fonts, it's reasonable to start with the basic alphabet. So usually the first one I go ahead and fix is the lowercase n. And this will tell you most of the process. So I copy it, pop it in the background. On italics, you can, well, first of all, you really have to have the top and bottom extrema for rendering quality. So that's good that the script helps put those in. And then we can delete the sort of curved point. And Glyphs app, why I'm working in it right now, is that it's really good at keeping the curvature when I delete that. So you can see that the program has to do some computation to know where these off curves should go to keep that same basic shape. I also copied it to the background, which I can get between with like Command B. And I copy it to the background just so I have some reference for myself as I move things around. I'm actually going to nudge it up so the overshoot goes to kind of the center of my overshoot zone. I may adjust that approach a little bit, but for now I'm kind of uniting my overshoot pretty consistently. And I've got a video where I was trying to figure out whether it matters how consistent you are with uniting your overlap. I posted that experiment to like my Twitter and Instagram and got some comments that informed me that so long as like a renderer is doing what it should, and especially if you've got some hinting going on, it doesn't really have to be to the exact unit the same. As long as you've got these alignment zones, it should be pretty good. But and then the other thing to say about that is that like a wider curve tends to need more overshoot optically than a narrow curve. So for instance, like a D has kind of a tight curve and an E has a rounder, wider curve. So optically, in general, your E would benefit from slightly more overshoot than the D. And this comes even more into play if you're making a width axis. Say a narrow O doesn't necessarily need too much overshoot, whereas a really wide O needs a lot more overshoot. And that kind of makes sense because like we don't go and give basic stems overshoot if it's just like a rectangle. So if the narrow O is really close to basically being a rectangle, it probably doesn't really need overshoot. So that's at least how I think about it. Whatever's closer to a rectangle needs less optical compensation. So that's the basic process for getting close or in the ballpark of the italic shape I want. At least in this family, I think it makes a lot of sense to do this like mix of rotation and skew. And then kind of the second pass is like some sort of bumpiness is here that I don't really want. Partly like to make a circle look round in an upright form. No, sorry, let me start again. To make a round shape look actually circular in a geometric font, you need to have shoulders that are just a little bit more than circular. So let me actually show that. Display bold, where are you? All right, so I'll pop this one open in RoboFont. And let's look at like the capital O. So this looks pretty much like a circle. But like if you actually look closely at it, these are not quite circular. And there's a funny thing that happens too, where like if text is smaller or there's more text, you need to sort of make it a little less like a circle to look more like a circle. But if we were to actually draw a circle here, it would, let's compare it actually. Oops, that is not quite the right thing. So if I draw a circle to the full height, you'll notice I'm like going between programs, so I have to rethink my hotkeys sometimes. But you can see that just subtly, the outside of this O is a little wider, and the sort of corners of it are just a little bit super elliptical compared to a normal geometric circle. And then the inside is just a little more narrow. It's a little more like an ellipse. And that's because the sides need to be slightly thicker than the top and bottom to optically appear monolinear. And everybody does this just a little differently. So part of making a font look good is trying to be a little bit consistent about how you do that. The result of this is partly that if you just rotate a circle to make an italic, suddenly these sort of shoulders that are only slightly rectangular when it's upright suddenly look pretty clearly rectangular or like squarcular or hyperelliptical when it's rotated. So part of what the next stage of fixing is me trying to kind of smooth those out just slightly to avoid that appearance just a little bit. So this, for instance, is why I've typed out the alphabet with, or, you know, used a small Python snippet to like make the alphabet such that each letter can be edited, and then right next to it is the same letter just in pure black, so I can actually see the result. So I'm like, I select a point looking at it, but when I'm actually moving it around, often I'm trying to look beside it to see what the actual effect is on the filled shape. So yeah, that's kind of a more useful way to actually operate a lot of the times. you get a better sense of what's really happening. And I suppose I should be probably editing not only this Roman A, but the A italic, which is like a single story A, because this is the one that I want to be default in the italic family. But I do want the option of the double story A, so I'll edit both. Let me bring back my margins. There's just like, various shortcuts you can do to like show or hide margins, show or hide guides, etc. Show or hide background. It's often like Command Shift and then a relevant key. Yeah, so let's start the process here. This one's a little more complex. Well, since I'm here, let me just do the O as well. And by the way, today there is a healthy amount of construction in my neighborhood, so hopefully that doesn't leak a ton into the audio and be super distracting, but it's possible it will. I'm also quietly listening to some music in my headphones, just kind of to keep me awake and productive. I'm listening to Manuel Gardner Fernandez, his solo album, Volume 1, which I think is very recent. He is the guitarist for a prog metal band I really like called Unprocessed. And he's not necessarily like the best guitar player in my opinion. Not that I could do remotely close to as good of guitar playing, but some guitarists are like ungodly good. I think his strength is in writing really cool songs, and I don't know, I've just seen like a YouTube of him where he like plays a beautifully written riff but doesn't necessarily play it in a way that's like super locked on the tempo. So I don't know, but I don't know why I'm like saying all that. I still super enjoy listening to his music and definitely recommend it. And I feel like, writing music and performing music are slightly, to me, similar to like making a font versus doing calligraphy. So like they're both valid and cool skills. And a font, like writing music, you can kind of like sit there and refine the idea a lot over time and make it something really interesting and refined and maybe quantized and such with software. Whereas performing a guitar piece is like writing something with calligraphy, and you kind of have to nail it as a physical skill to really do it perfectly. I don't know. I promise I don't relate everything to fonts, or at least I don't always talk about it. So something worth mentioning is that like as we're making extrema and deleting these angled points, some of these spots you should keep the angled points and delete the extrema. So a good example of that is the N, where this needs extrema, but over here we deleted extrema here and here because those would create short little segments that would not interpolate well, and they're less necessary for good text rendering. And so the same is happening in the A, but it's a little more complex of a shape. The other thing that I haven't done just yet is actually something I find very helpful is Jens Kudelec's curve EQ script. And this balances the handles, meaning that like if we were to draw a guide across there and a guide across there, they would be basically parallel, as you can see. An unbalanced set of handles can achieve a very similar curve some of the time, but it has like a little less predictable of interpolations, especially between here and the hairline. So for that reason, and also slightly less predictable conversion from my cubic Bezier drawing, which is like this OTF flavor. This gets kind of nerdy, but basically slightly less predictable results when you convert this source format into a TTF. Yeah. I'm just kind of like looking at the end, like, how much does this get thicker here than here optically? I might pop open the normal display. Might as well do it in glyphs, just so I have a really clear comparison I could do. Say I don't want to move anything in this case. Okay, so there I feel like it very, very slightly, maybe just slightly flares here. But not really. I think it's pretty similar optically. And I'm basically trying to make it look at first glance like it's monolinear, because the whole inspiration of this family is tile lettering that is often extremely monolinear. Anyway, I think I do maybe have to pull it in just slightly. Yeah, honestly, maybe that was as much as it needed. Something like that. I'll probably continue to tweak it here and there. Let's also balance these curves. Oh, this is a funny thing that happens if the start points of contours are on off curve points, as I think that kind of happens if I'm like removing angled points and it's kind of picking the next thing for a start node. So I've got to go in here, make sure that the start nodes are what are called on curve points rather than off curve points. Okay, and you can see that that script is very good at balancing all the handles while not really visually changing the shape. Yeah, like I can't see the difference there. So as long as I can't really see the difference, but it's technically better, it's a pretty big win in my book. And we'll have a little more to do with this A once we delete these points, but let's just start with that. And so in the hairline, actually, because this A has to like have this slanted, and this happens all over, but there's a slanted main stem now. So it works a lot better actually if we chop this and allow that to be like an overlapping shape. So let's bring this into line here. Then we can delete both of these points. And then let's see, I want to pretty much flatten that and flatten this, but then we'll have to bring it all down slightly. I have a hard time sometimes, okay, telling when a point is horizontally or vertically aligned in glyphs. Oh well. Sometimes I'm off by a couple units, and I only notice it once I go back into RoboFont, which is kind of funny. I don't know how much that is because I'm slightly more used to RoboFont now versus how much is just a little better for precise alignment of things. So I think I better bring that down. I guess something I could do here, I should check how that is looking compared to this, and maybe I'll even, oh, interesting. So there's more compensation. Let me actually delete that for now. There's more compensation happening in this like middle stroke in the A, in the upright, than I have so far done here. And a lot of these like slightly unintuitive shaping things from the upright Display Bold A are moments where like it started with kind of shaping that to me at this scale was more geometric looking, but then as soon as I took it onto actual usage, like in text and headlines on the web or in print, I started to see things don't always look as geometric as you expect them to. So things like middle lines have to kind of, it's like not it's not just geometry, but also like balance and color and things, spacing. And also, yeah, the appearance of geometry at scales that people more typically use a font at. Like sometimes the A has to be a little sharper here than, say, the N or the B. So it can be, yeah, a little bit of a game. But anyway, I will basically trust my earlier measurement there. And then, I'll decide later in proofs if it has to change any further. But I guess potentially these should move down a little bit too. Okay. And then to me, that seems like these need to be skewed slightly more. All right, that's pretty good. Let's do this now. And after this shape, I might kind of leave off just because I feel like I've covered a good portion of the basics of how I'm approaching this redrawing process. So let's make this node first again. Okay, that's an on-curve node. That's solid. One challenge actually is like, okay, so you'll see that like this stem is obviously rotated. And basically like this join is higher than it was in the Roman or upright. So this kind of notch is bigger. In the Roman, these notches are really balanced. So like say between the D and the A, or the D and the N, these are rotationally similar. And then it's also similar to like this and this notch. These are all the same size. But once we get into the italics, like just the way that these are sort of slanted and rotated a bit leads to a slightly difficult problem. How do we make them work with similar like geometry and structure while also having sort of optically similar notches? So you can see here like, and it's also like, how do we keep the Notch is similar while keeping the joins to be a similar thickness. This is the textile, so the joins are a little bit thinner and such. Yeah, and I might have to do another tweak or pass to get some of these things to be exactly as I want them. So like one problem I see right now is that like this appears to be thicker than this, which appears to be more pointy. But the bigger problem is that this notch is very wide, whereas this one is quite a lot smaller. So those look kind of rotated, whereas I don't want them to necessarily look so rotated. So I don't know. That's like something I don't even necessarily have an answer for right away. I'll just kind of be experimenting to find the answer. And to an extent, I think it's like partly inevitable and okay. And like I do like the rotated look to an extent, like quite a lot. But for instance, like one thing I'll probably experiment with, especially in a display, is like how does it look if I match the notch more and just kind of let it be like thin here, but almost more monolinear here. It kind of maybe gets gummed up in there, which could be a problem. But maybe now it looks a little more like a line of tiles going into another line of tiles. I don't know, a little hard to figure out what I feel like about that just yet. Yeah, I think it's a little much for now, but maybe in the right spirit of things, honestly. I think maybe prioritizing notch similarity slightly over path thickness similarity might be the right way to go, but I'm still kind of figuring that out. And I don't necessarily think this balance is exactly right yet, but I think I have to try it and evaluate it more in context rather than just sitting here and knowing what the right answer is on the first time I try it. I don't think that's really how type design tends to work. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that's an interesting shape. 266. Oh, so this bowl is quite a bit lower. All right, it was optically looking like that, but I wanted a sanity check. Yeah, not that you should necessarily base decisions on how closely these things align, but I think it can be helpful to sometimes start with that and then decide how the result looks and how that may or may not make sense in your particular project. I sort of like to try to make fonts that are just slightly more on the mathematical side, because I feel like there's just something interesting, in kind of architected or engineered sense, rather than something that's too free form or something. I feel like if you go overboard with optical corrections, you might end up with I don't know, humanist sands every time or something. I'm not sure. That's probably not really true, but I feel like some designers have like a looser style, and that can be super cool. And then some designers have a tighter style, and I feel like that can also be super cool. And so I guess maybe thematically I'm drawn to a slightly tighter style some of the time. Or, yeah, depending on the project. For name sans, certainly it's modeled after tile signage that was essentially, as I understand it, designed by engineers, or architects rather. So like I feel like it should probably embrace a sense of being designed by numbers a little bit. Okay, so I know I said I'd stop after the last one, but I kind of wanted to try this out too. Yeah, this seems off center slightly. Maybe that's a little better. Yeah, so here I'm more trying to unify the notches of white space than the strokes of black space. And I kind of like that look quite a bit, actually. I mean, yeah, I did say that it has to be something that I evaluate more in context. It's a little bit of both, right? Part of it is evaluating it in context, and part of it is just kind of deciding how you subjectively feel about something. The italics like necessitate some strange decisions, and also in a cool way, italics like should be slightly weird. Like arguably they're more functional if they're a little more different from their Roman counterpoints. And so that gives you a little bit of freedom to try something just slightly more flavorful, perhaps. So in this case, maybe that is that rather than trying to make the strokes as symmetrical as possible, it's more about balancing symmetry of white space. Okay, actually, this will be my last one. ABC, that feels pretty good, plus NO. The C is a hard one in a way, in a weird way, because like you'd think it would be obvious with the O what to do. And yet the C is often compensated for a little bit differently. Like it often has to be slightly narrower. And then the fact that like the terminals so clearly show rotation, like you can very clearly see that this angle does not reflect this angle. It's a rotated reflection. That just starts to like cause, I don't know. Yeah, it takes a few extra decisions to make it happen. So like, yeah, this is actually a pretty funny, interesting shape. I made it in the text italics, which I feel like does look pretty good at small scale. Like, and it kind of centers the opening next to things. So like, I think that's sort of a good thing. It makes it feel even if you look at the shape really up close and think like, oh wow, that's, quite a lot of asymmetry really. When you step back, it just looks like a C. And so the sort of question now in the display end of the spectrum, since people will be viewing this at a literally larger scale, or that's the general use of this style, what is the right call for how to treat that? This may be a case where I should actually make alternate versions. That can be a useful thing to do. Oops, I forgot to run this curve EQ. All right. Yeah, in a way, it might kind of make sense to allow the display to have a more rotated look. And yet, even so, this looks optically closer to me, even though it's not really to the end. Like this almost has to come up a little further for it to look not like, at least for it to look like it's not like rotated further than the italic angle even. It's a bit of a balancing act. So probably something I'll do is, let me try this. I'm going to select the segment, get my rotate tool, and like put it up here in the middle of the bowl basically, and then rotate it like that. And a big thing to know about rotating points in any font editor really is that like the further you can get away from your axis of rotation, or like your transformation point, which is I'm pointing for no good reason. You can see that my rotation center is here, but then I have way more control if I'm dragging as far away as possible than if I'm dragging like really close. If I'm dragging right here, I have no control. It's just like, woo. This is actually true in Illustrator and stuff too. But if I'm out here, I can actually like move it a lot more slowly and have more control of it. So yeah, basically I am trying to be fairly subtle. Maybe I should boost this a little bit bigger. I'm just kind of trying to get it to where it kind of optically looks more balanced on the right edge here. So I think that's pretty close. And then I feel like I need to correct what I just did a little. Yeah, I mean, for all of these decisions, I feel like it's relatively likely that I'll end up coming back and redoing them here and there a little bit. Just kind of part of how it goes. But it's not bad. Of course, against the O, the amount of rotation in the C is actually super weird. So that's probably another reason I balanced this one a lot more. Like I didn't want it to look like it was about to crash into the O, even though there was a big wide space down below. Here, the spacing in the display is so tight that like is quite emphasized. To the extent that like I almost want to make like a contextual alternate potentially, but there's probably a good way to balance it out, and I just have to kind of mess with it a little bit to see what it is. You don't always reflect the N for a U. In fact, you almost always have to kind of knock it in just a little bit to make the space slightly narrower. If you don't do that, it just looks kind of incorrect. because I think the theory goes like a space that opens upwards, our eye naturally kind of gravitates towards the x height of a font as we're reading. So like if it's the exact same width between the U and the N counter, even if they're a very similar shape, the U will look wider. And that's pretty true. And it's just kind of about how much as a designer you think you need to compensate for that. So, honestly, this is a pretty good rotated C. So maybe I'll keep that as an alt for now. I never know what to know alts. I should really have like a consistent method, like experiment. Italic. I'll call it that for now. I don't know. Why not? I'll also create a glyph style layer. So what if I rotate both of these? Pretty curious what might happen. Let's add a guide there, and add a guide there, and see how it looks if we rotate from where they meet. And I'm looking a bit more at the bottom text on my screen than at the actual shape of my glyph above. This is really tough because like here it looks a lot more natural, honestly. I mean, unless we really get into the specifics of these curves, like once we do that, it's a little hard. I don't know if this will help. Yeah, maybe slightly. So if we do that, it looks more natural against the O, but then a little unnatural against the N. It's a bit of a catch-22. I feel like probably in the text I had to make the same call where I sort of balanced it between like crashing with the O versus crashing with the N. Italics force you to think in like ways you really don't expect to. So that's just part of what makes them a little hard, but also, what makes them a little bit fun. Because once you've really settled into a family, you'd think it would be really just the easiest thing in the world to create italics. And yet, it's just not. It's kind of a whole other ball game. Yeah, I'll try that for now. It's a little bit like on the bottom, this almost looks like it's a reference to a script where you'd have like a exit stroke kind of leading into the next letter. So I think it kind of makes sense to sort of balance the rotation with the not crashing into the O. Because if it crashes into the O, to me that just looks kind of bad. Yeah, so I'll just have to keep on making similar decisions as I go through the lowercase and the numerals and the uppercase and the symbols. And yeah, to be honest, I think really hard about the basic alphabet. And then it becomes slightly more automatic once I've made those decisions. I can generally apply that to the symbols a little more quickly. And then a lot of the symbols are just like more about correcting contrast. And actually, that's a good thing we should end on. It's correcting contrast. So like if something is just skewed, like this V, already in the letter V, because our brain is so used to seeing like a contrasty serif, for instance, font, that kind of came from drawing with a broad nib pen. So like as you go in one direction, it's a thick line and the other direction is a thin line. Even if you want to make an extremely monolinear looking V, you kind of have to like play with this idea. And if we measure this, I'm almost positive. Yeah, Actually, it's more than I expect. So keep in mind, this is on a 2048 unit UPM, so the coordinate grid is basically double that of what you might often draw. But even so, like this stroke, even though it looks the exact same, or maybe depending how you look at it, maybe it looks slightly thinner than this one. I don't know. It's thicker. You can see that. So on the left, there's 300 units, and on the right, there's 286. And then up top, there's 325 and 308. And so that's the other thing that's happening. It slightly tapers towards the bottom because otherwise it would appear if I was just creating a V that was completely symmetrical and had no taper, it would end up looking like it was getting thicker towards the bottom. So it's kind of challenging to make a font that appears to be super simple. But once we take this like slight optical correction and then skew it, this side becomes closer to an upright rectangle, and this side becomes closer to a line, like a horizontal line, actually. So I think I showed this in the prior video, but like let's look for a second. If we, I'll just use a space character, I guess. If I draw a rectangle, and then I just start skewing this, it becomes a thinner and thinner line. That's just how like the math of it works out. So likewise, if I start with a diagonal line and then I bring it more upright, it becomes a thicker line. So that's what's happening on the left side here. It goes from a diagonal, like medium thickness line to more of an upright, thicker line. And then the opposite is happening on this side where it's becoming a thinner and thinner line. All that is to say, once you realize that's happening, you can mostly fix this by just like coming in here and hitting your arrow keys a little bit until it looks right again. And that's slightly complicated by the fact that like maybe there's also a slight change that needs to happen here so it kind of stays like looking like it's aligned. That actually becomes a little tricky in diagonal, or rather italicized arrows. That becomes a tough game to make them look like they're still arrows pointing in the middle rather than rotated and pointing down and being monolinear and like looking like an arrow. I don't know. Yeah, first few times I tried it, it still trips me out when I try to do it. So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. W is fun. I'll do it even though I said the V would be my last. I have a theory that like the biggest thing determining whether you'll get good at an activity, like whether it's font design or code or skateboarding or playing guitar or who knows what else, it's like, can you get into a workflow where you continually want to try just one more thing and like you kind of allow yourself to get carried away with that? Like, I'm just going to try one more thing to see if it will work. At least for me, that's the only way, basically, I tend to get better at things. This is a little tough because, like, oh well, you know what? I'll figure this one out on my own. I need to rest my voice and listen to a podcast. By the way, as a quick, would you call it addendum to the video, I continued to work on this a little bit after doing some recording, and as I went further through the lowercase, I started to kind of relearn some lessons that I think I had kind of learned in the text italic process. One thing that I didn't actually do this yesterday, but I think I'll do it while I'm working now, is that it's pretty useful to have a reference point for the control characters as you're making things italic. So, for instance, this is showing us some possible why is it not showing the metrics more than that? I don't know. This is showing us some possible or probable spacing kerning issue. And, well, the Y is symmetrical, as is the O. And the kerning is mostly symmetrical. So I probably have to look into that, for instance, in a second pass. Like, as you slant things, the spacing can get kind of changed in interesting ways. But also, yeah, I think the lack of these reference control characters, in particular, maybe the E doesn't look quite as italic as it perhaps should. It's a little hard to say. It's not bad. I think it's almost that like maybe the bottom could move to the left very slightly. And then I haven't done the uppercase basic English yet. And the big lesson I was learning as well, or relearning, I should say, is that for me at least, I think, oh, there's the metrics window I was expecting. I think that perhaps a good way to decide where the terminals of the C should be was to, and the S is this way as well. Oh, so maybe I've got it in the S already. Let's see. It's basically to, the spacing is a little wonky, but if we look at the background layer, it kind of erases it slightly, but let's cut one of these. So here is the upright version of S, and here is the italic prepped version that's somewhat skewed and somewhat rotated. And I feel like pretty much the ideal place to put the terminals for the letter to make it look italic but not rotated, but not just upright, is basically halfway between the upright terminals and the rotalic terminals, the like rotated and skewed thing. And I feel like that's fairly similar for the C. Honestly, I'm forgetting if I did that consciously here. So let's actually just go and copy this to check. So I'll copy that. Let's go to the background. And yeah, I feel like even without trying to consciously do it, the terminals are almost in the middle here of the upright to the rotated and skewed version. And actually, just to be logically consistent, maybe I'll pull this one back slightly more to make it halfway between. So let me kind of show that in the uppercase C just to show how I might do that. Let's see, oops. All right, we'll go to the background, paste the upright, kind of make the strokes line up for the most part, especially on this right side. And let's also copy that to the background. Then we will delete the old extremas and allow the new ones to be there. Shift it upwards so it's more centered in the overall overshoot space. And then, yeah, so I think let's grab this, get our rotate tool going, click kind of, well, first I'm going to remove the guidelines if I can. I guess just like that. And maybe let's add new ones to see if we can find a decent center point of the glyph. It may or may not work very well. Yeah, kind of close. All right, so yeah, I'll use this center point here, rotate it up to about halfway, as you can see, between them. And I'll have to fix this This is a little bit too straight of a line at the moment, or too straight of a curve rather. And then this curve will be too kind of, it slopes down really quickly here, whereas this one kind of gets a little flattened. So let's fix that. And let's zoom out so we can see this version as well. Yeah, so that's getting pretty close to something that looks pretty decent. Maybe I'll pull this up a little bit because it was looking thin at the bottom. Yeah, like many things, it could be endlessly tweaked, but it's relatively good. I feel like italics are a lot about finding shortcuts that get you part of the way there and then fiddling with it a bit to get the rest of the way there. But this kind of splits the difference between like the bottom being too far over against a vertical side and the top being too far over against a rounded side. And yeah, and I feel like it mostly still keeps its overall slant, so that's a good thing. Yeah, and then I just have to kind of figure out how I like it. I guess I should say I don't believe I've fixed the O yet, so I'll probably go and fix that O and then come back to the C and make sure these two are balanced off together. But, you know, it's looking mostly pretty okay so far. So I just wanted to kind of show that process. As with everything I've said about italics, I feel like it's very dependent on the project. So some projects, a full-on rotated italic looks really cool. Some projects, maybe more of a skew with a little bit of roundness correction would look really cool. And yeah, I'm sure there's all sorts of approaches between the two that could make a lot of sense. But here, this feels just slightly rotated, but I don't know. I guess I'm going for neutrality or somewhat close to it. And something that like maybe an engineer or architect would apply to the upright to make it italic. So yeah, back to the former video's conclusion, I think. But hopefully if you are kind of puzzling through how to make italics, seeing my process of working on it was, if nothing else, entertaining, but hopefully informative. And yeah, if you're making type, hope it's looking awesome. Hope you're having a good week. Thanks.